The wind still moves the same way across the Iranian plateau. It sweeps down from the Alborz mountains in long, dry gusts, carrying dust from lands that were once the center of everything. Stand here long enough, and you can almost hear it. The distant echo of an empire that once stretched from the shores of the Aegean Sea to the banks of the Indus River. This was Persia. And in 474 BC, it was bleeding.
We trace the footsteps of
To
our
understand what was
ancestors
happening
back
here,
past the
you have to
conquests
step
of
back.
Darius,
Not
into
just
the
a few
lands of the
decades,
Medes.
but into the
We have
full sweep
catalogued every
of what the
district.
Achaemenid Empire had
The
become.
colored markers indicate
At
the
its
assigned
peak,
satrapies
it was
for
the
coming
largest
year.
empire the world had ever seen. 50 million people. A third of the entire global population at the time. From Egypt to Central Asia, from the Black Sea coast to the Persian Gulf, one man's word was law. And that man, in 474 BC, was Xerxes I, a king who had already looked westward toward Greece and had already paid the price for what he found there. Because 6 years earlier, at the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC, the Persian fleet had been destroyed, not by a superior force, but by a smaller, desperate one. The Greeks, hopelessly outnumbered, had lured the massive Persian armada into the narrow straits between the island of Salamis and the Athenian coast. There, in waters too tight for Persian numbers to matter, the Greek triremes tore through the fleet like wolves through a flock. Xerxes watched from a golden throne on the hillside above. He watched his empire's naval power collapse in a single afternoon. What followed was not just a military defeat. It was a psychological fracture at the heart of the Persian world. By 474 BC, Xerxes had retreated to Persepolis, the ceremonial capital his father Darius had begun, and which he had continued to build with obsessive grandeur.
Watch the ropes, keep it moving.
Walk through its ruins today, and the scale still silences you. Columns 30 meters tall, bas-reliefs stretching for hundreds of meters, carved with delegations from every corner of the empire. Lydians, Egyptians, Indians, Ethiopians, all bringing tribute, all bowing toward the center. This was not just architecture. This was political theater in stone. A message to the world. We are everywhere. We are everything. But behind those walls, something had shifted. The court of Xerxes in 474 BC was a place of paranoia and intrigue. Ancient sources, Greek, Babylonian, and Persian alike, describe a king increasingly withdrawn, increasingly surrounded by advisors whose loyalty was transactional. The harem politics of the Achaemenid court were not mere gossip. They were governance. Wives, concubines, eunuchs, and generals all competed for proximity to the king because proximity to the king was power. One wrong word, one failed campaign, one whispered accusation, and a man could vanish. The ordinary people of the empire felt none of the marble and gold. In the villages of what is now Fars province, in southern Iran, farmers grew barley and kept goats, paid their taxes in grain and silver, and lived lives almost entirely untouched by the grand dramas of Persepolis above them. We know this not from epic poetry, but from clay tablets, thousands of them discovered in the treasury and fortification walls of Persepolis itself. These administrative records, written in Elamite, document rations paid to workers, so many litres of grain to stonecutters, so many to guards, so many to women labourers, because women worked on the construction of Persepolis, and they were paid, a fact that surprises almost everyone who hears it. Equal rations to men, sometimes more when pregnant. This was an empire of contradictions, brutal in conquest, surprisingly pragmatic in administration. The Persians, unlike the Assyrians before them, did not erase the cultures they absorbed. They adopted local languages, local gods, local customs. Cyrus the Great had famously freed the Jews from Babylonian captivity.
Receive
Darius
this
had allowed
offering,
Egyptian
great
temples to
Horus,
continue functioning.
master of the
The
sky.
empire held together
May
not
your
through
favor
terror
shine
alone,
upon us.
but through a
Through these
sophisticated
diverse
system of
laws,
tolerance
we
that
administer
was in
not
many
with
ways
terror,
ahead of
but
its
with
time.
tolerance and respect
And
for
yet,
local tradition.
the wars with Greece had opened a wound that would not close. By 474 BC, the Delian
As you can
League,
see,
an
the route
alliance of
along the
Greek
coast is too
city-states led by
exposed.
Athens,
We use
was
the
on the
island for cover,
offensive.
moving swiftly
Cimon,
before the equinox.
the Athenian general, was systematically clearing Persian forces from the Aegean coastline. The island of Ion fell. Skyros fell.
Fall back.
The
Every
Greek
man for
world
himself.
was pushing back,
Push them back
and
to the
Persia,
sea.
exhausted
Advance the line.
and internally fractured, was losing ground it had held for generations. Persian garrisons that had once seemed permanent were being dismantled one by one along a coastline that Darius had believed was permanently his. There is something quietly devastating about this moment. Not because Persia was failing. It wasn't, not yet. Not for another century and a half, but because you can see in 474 BC the first long shadow of what would eventually come. The empire would survive. It would even stabilize. But the dream of a Persian Greece, of an Achaemenid Empire stretching to the Western Sea, died somewhere in the Straits of Salamis and was buried quietly in the retreating footsteps of Xerxes.
Here are your dates, measured fairly.
Meanwhile, in Babylon, one of the empire's great urban hearts, the population went about their lives with the particular resilience of people who had survived many conquerors and expected to survive many more. The markets along the Euphrates traded in textiles, dates, silver, and slaves.
May the heavens
Temple
bless
priests
this
maintained
offering.
rituals that were already
The contract
2,000
is
years old.
sealed.
Merchants wrote contracts on clay tablets using a script that had been invented for this very purpose, to record debts, to formalize agreements, to ensure
The
that
terms
even
are
in a
settled.
world of
By the
chaos,
scales,
a deal
it is done.
was a deal.
The contract
This is what
binding.
history so often forgets. That while kings fought and empires trembled, the actual texture of life, the bread baked before dawn, the children taught to read in schools attached to temples, the old woman who knew which herbs cured fever and which caused it, continued, quietly, persistently, with a dignity that no army could entirely erase. Xerxes himself would not live much longer. In 465 BC, he was assassinated, murdered in his bedchamber by the commander of his royal guard and a powerful court official named Artabanus. The details are disputed, the motives unclear, the successor briefly contested. It was the kind of ending that empires produce. Not a battlefield death, not a heroic last stand, but a knife in the dark and a throne passed in blood.
Your Majesty,
And yet,
these are the
Persia
agreed upon
endured.
boundaries. The Aegean
Through
must remain
Artaxerxes
free.
I,
My lord,
through
they
decades
press too
more of
hard on
war
Ionia.
and
Push
negotiation
through.
with Greece,
To the gate.
through internal
Advance.
revolts and Egyptian uprisings, and the slow, grinding work of keeping 50 million people inside one political idea. It endured until Alexander of Macedon arrived in 334 BC and burned Persepolis to the ground. Some say accidentally, some say deliberately, some say both. And the Achaemenid dream finally ended. What remains today is extraordinary. The ruins of Persepolis rise from the plain of Marvdasht in southern Iran, and they are, even in ruin, monumental.
These are the
The gate of
famous
all
human-headed
nations still
bulls.
stands.
This is where
Its
ambassadors
stone
from
bulls
across the
watching over a
empire would
threshold
enter
that
to pay
once
their
welcomed
respects.
ambassadors from every civilization on Earth. The carvings on the Apadana staircase still show those delegations, still perfectly detailed after 2,500 years, Nubians carrying elephant tusks, Greeks bringing metal vessels, Armenians leading a stallion. Look at those faces long enough, and something crosses time. These were real people, carved by real hands, representing real journeys made to this real place. They came from the edges of the known world to stand before a king who believed he had been chosen by Ahura Mazda, the great god of truth
We
and light,
invoke truth
to bring
and
order to
light
chaos.
against chaos.
Whether
In
he
the name
succeeded is a
of
question
Ahura
history
Mazda.
answers differently depending on who you
Observe the
ask.
order and splendor of the empire,
The
envoy.
Greeks said no.
Do not mistake
The
our
Persians
patience
said
for weakness.
yes.
Your
The
generosity
farmers
is
of Faras
noted, my
province
lord.
probably never thought about it at all. But here, on this plateau, in this dry and ancient wind, the argument still echoes.
Heave!
Empires
Pull
rise
together now.
believing they are permanent.
Up! Lift it up!
They build in
Steady!
stone precisely because they fear impermanence. And then, time does what time always does. It keeps moving. It keeps asking the same question of every civilization that reaches for the sky. How long? And at what cost?